Chapter 6. Settling In. "You've been holding out on us, Kenobi," Garen Mullen hissed, elbowing his way into a spot at the table. Padawans Brand Aaron and Reeve glanced between the accused and the new arrival. "What?" asked Obi-Wan through a full mouth. Garen ducked his head, glancing over his shoulder at the busy refractory. "You never told me you had a criffing uncle in the Order." "What?" Reeve burst, belching as he did so. Obi-Wan swallowed his food and his suppressed panic with it. Yeah," he said, very awkwardly, leaning back from the table. "Wait, you do?" Band asked. "You son of a Gundark." Garen was smiling manically. "Uncle as in related uncle? What is he like?" "I've never heard about another Kenobi." "He's right over there." Garen pointed subtly over his shoulder. Reeve turned his whole body to look, and Garen smacked him. "Don't do that, he'll see us," he hissed. "Wow." Band was more tactful in respying. "He does look like you, Obi. What's his name?" "Jedi Master Ben Kenobi," Garen pronounced with mock airs. "An uncle and a master to boot." "I've never heard of him before." Band was frowning. "Obi-Wan?" All three of them looked to the reticent friend who was scrambling to remember the story the council had fed to him. How it had spread so quickly to the rumor mill also known as the Junior Padawan Dojo, he wouldn't guess. "I only met him a few weeks ago," he said. It wasn't a lie. "He's been watchman to assist him in the Outer Rim for years. This is the first time he's been in the temple since I was in the crash." That was the lie. "Wow," Reeve said, turning, more subtly, to look again. "For that long? And in the Outer Rim? Chist, what did he do to get stuck there?" Garen looked over his shoulder, watching as Ben Kenobi filled a glass with water and thanked the serving droid at the salad station. "Sounds like a loose cannon to me," the Padawan decided, turning around to stuff a heaping spoon of darrow root salad into his mouth. "I bet he's good friends with Master Qui-Gon, eh?" Garen smiled around his lunch. Obi-Wan shrugged. "They've met. Don't really seem to get on well." Which, considering the actual truth, hurt him a lot more than it should have. "That's a shame," Reeve said between bites. "Why not?" "I don't know," Obi-Wan admitted. I think they knew each other before the whole Outer Rim thing." He wondered if he would get in trouble with Ben or the Council for coming up with his own lies. "But I guess they grew apart." Was Reeve's only answer, because his mouth was full again. "I wonder what happened." Ben wondered quietly. Obi-Wan shrugged at her. He couldn't tell her he'd been preoccupied with the problem for as long as Ben had been here, because then he'd have to explain why. "I don't know." He bit into his sandwich. With ravenous pubescent appetites and good food in abundance, the four Padawans continued their meal without conversation, opting to commune in a guttural chorus of crunching, chewing, and slurping, punctuated by occasional belching from Reeve's direction, followed by an apology. "Ah, youth." A new voice reminisced over their mealtime carnage. They all turned to look, but Padawan Aaron was the only one with an empty mouth. "Master Kenobi," she spoke for the group, gills flashing in an even brighter red than normal. Ben quirked an eyebrow and smiled at Obi-Wan. "I see I need no introduction." "I apologize, Master Kenobi." Obi-Wan's ears reddened. "You really must stop calling me that, Obi-Wan. If anything, Master Ben will do." He glanced at Garen and Reeve, and despite how the sight of them sent daggers of bittersweet grief through his heart, their stuffed cheek, surprised faces made him smile. "Padawans?" He nodded, acknowledging their fascinated staring. They swallowed in a rush and bowed from their seats. "Master Kenobi," they chorused. Reeve coughed and apologized. "Is there something you need, Master... Ben?" Obi-Wan asked politely, not wishing to be rid of Ben so much as he wished to be rid of the situation. Garen was looking between Obi-Wan and Ben with rabid attention. "Yes, actually. I've been looking for your master all morning. Do you know where I might find him?" Obi-Wan frowned slightly. "No, he hasn't told me his plans for today. I'm sorry." Obi-Wan was in the middle of his study cycle and was thus occupied with classes most of the day. Qui-Gon's activities were his own prerogative. Ben nodded in understanding. "I see. Thank you." Ben nodded at his younger self. "A good day to you all." He turned to leave and paused momentarily to smirk at the Dracelian member who'd already begun stuffing his face again. "A word of advice, Padawan Reeve." He smiled impishly beneath his mustache. "It does tend to help if one chews before swallowing." He stepped away before the poor boy could stop choking on his embarrassment. Garen Moon, compassionate friend that he was, roared with laughter. Obi-Wan's been telling him that for years, he called after the retreating master. Obi-Wan fought back a smile. Still am, apparently, he muttered to himself. How did he know my name? Reef wondered aloud once he'd stopped choking. Garen was still laughing too hard for them to hear. It had been almost 3 weeks since Ben Kenobi had appeared from the future. Thanks to the Council's quick response, his assimilation into the temple life had been quiet, swift, and handled with the same spare-no-expense routine of perjury that the Council used to send their knights deep undercover for special missions. His lengthy medical records had been updated to the best of his memory, much to the horror and wonder of Okara J. While she'd had him imprisoned in the halls, she had also altered his fingerprints just slightly enough so that they no longer fetched Obi-Wan's data. The DNA problem was still a work in progress, but since fingerprints were the standard medical identifiers, it wouldn't be an immediate problem. Within days, the Council had delivered him new identification documents and effects, along with a collection of phony mission reports from years past, which they asked him to review for the sake of continuity. They had created a new history for him. He'd spent the last 11 years acting as watchman to the Hewn sector in the Outer Rim. Although he'd never trained an apprentice, he'd been promoted to the title of Master some years ago, following a mission into Hutt space. He made a note to read that report first. He didn't know which council member had been tasked with coming up with the thick holobook of reports that Ben Kenobi was supposed to have sent in over the past decade, but he admired the dedication to the Grand Lie. He was flattered by the description of his fake heroics. It was interesting reading, at least. They had allowed him to keep his surname, which was a pleasant surprise. What with his younger self running about, Ben had been fully prepared to select a new name and had intended to become Ben Lars in honor of his distant but incredibly important family on Tatooine. But a good lie is always built on a grain of truth, the Council insisted. Particularly as Obi-Wan grew older, the family resemblance would be impossible to explain. Therefore, on paper, Ben became Obi-Wan's biological uncle on his mother's side. It was not unheard of for Jedi to have blood relatives within the Order. Tholothian cousins Adi Gallia and Stas Alai were prime example. Ben supposed he ought to ask Master Gallia's thoughts on the matter next time he saw her. He had no idea how he'd be expected to act around Obi-Wan. He and his last nephew had never been allowed to have a very close relationship. But that could wait. There were other matters to attend to. Preoccupation with frivolities was not the Jedi way, but as Ben had learned repeatedly in the harsh dunes of Tatooine, there was something to be said about the practical benefits of homely comforts. They'd given him free claim to whichever living quarters were currently unoccupied, a flattering gesture. It didn't take him long to select a small, single-occupant apartment sequestered away on the outermost edge of the main residential level. It was shoved up against a massive bulkhead, which made it smaller than most of the other rooms. When he indicated the choice to the quartermaster, the Grand's eye stalks had raised in bemusement. "Usually only send fresh knights to live there," he'd said. "Things the size of a shoebox, and can get as hot as a boiler. You sure?" Small and warm, familiar commodities. "It's perfect." The robed Gran had shrugged, tapping an authorization code into his pad. "As you say, Master." Upon his arrival, the space was, true to the quartermaster's word, defined only by its size and temperature, but Ben intended to change that. Already, he'd adopted a small family of plants from the greenhouses and was beside himself with glee to have something green in his environment. One vine specimen, which preferred to grow downwards, he set to live atop the cooling unit in his very small kitchen. One he put on the windowsill in his bedroom, another on the low eating table in the common area, and the final 3 out on the balcony, which, in keeping with theme, was minuscule. "There, my young friend," Ben said, arranging the last of his new wards just so in the mid-morning light. "I've been told your home planet is a sunny one. I think you will enjoy it out here best." He repackaged the jostled soil in the pot with a smile. "I admit I never quite got used to it myself. Pale skin, you understand. Still, it's too damn cold out here at night. I never sleep." He brushed off his hands and stood with enjoyable ease. "But it's nice not having all joints to worry about." He looked around at his handiwork, 6 hopeful sprouts drinking up their water rations with contentment. He went inside and prepared a pot of tea. He sat atop his meditation cushion and surveyed his hovel with an irrepressible smile. "There now," he said, to his plants, to the old kitchen equipment and the stained carpet and the one slanted wall that hummed from the bulkhead behind it. "That's a bit more like home, isn't it?" It was frustrating trying to make friends with people you already knew. Hiding his true identity was not hard, and was in many ways a relief. Just being back in the temple, seeing the order back in its glory, was more than enough for Ben. Sacrificing his name and his history was of no consequence. But sacrificing his relationships was much harder. The younger they were, the easier it was. Padawans Ben and Garen and Reeft and the others were so vastly different than the knights Ben knew they would one day become, he could hardly think of them as the same people he'd known. In addition, he was able to interact with them from a position of authority, even if his relationship with Obi-Wan was a friendly one. He seldom had excuse to visit the Four en masse, but when he did, he tried to make it count. It was unnerving, but oddly, deeply satisfying to see his best friend's face fill with juvenile horror whenever he made witty comments at their expense. Even Obi-Wan's expression were worth the time. It was a perk of bearing the title Master, he supposed. In this respect, interacting with the younglings was a highlight of the time-traveling experience. Adults were another matter entirely. The Council was keeping an understandably close eye on Ben as he moved back into the Order. They consulted him regularly for the investigations on the disturbance, time travel, and the damage done in the lower levels. However, aside from the fact that the massive crater he'd arrived in had been filled, they never had much to report. Even so, they enjoyed sending representatives to see how he was doing. Whether this was a gesture of concern, or suspicion, or both, Ben was unsure. More often than not, they sent either Master Yoda or Master Windu. Master Yoda was easier to talk to. He had hardly changed from what Ben remembered, and of all the counselors was the most ready to accept Ben's odd predicament at face value. Yoda was the only person who made Ben forget, if even for a moment, that he was in the past. Master Windu, on the other hand, made it painfully obvious. The Corran was as businesslike in his demeanor as always, but there was a burr of underlying curiosity that never quite left him. He didn't know Ben, the time traveler realized eventually. He knew Obi-Wan, and he knew that Ben was Obi-Wan, and he was constantly drawing connections between the two. Coming from Ben's side, there was also the fact that, in the past, he and Mace had always been close friends. This led to misunderstandings now. There had been several awkward moments during their meetings where Ben had laughed a bit too openly, joked a bit too personally, or, heaven forbid, called Master Windu by his first name. Mace tried to take the slips in stride, but his discomfort was obvious. Ben wondered if he and the Corran would ever be friends in this timeline. In the face of such uncertainty, Ben turned his eyes away from people and towards more productive activities. It was a long-formed habit that had served him well on Tatooine. He found the lightsaber guru droid, Huyang, and levered his talents to polish his saber hilt to a shine it hadn't known since before the Clone Wars. He ordered new robes for himself, a new belt, boots, and a cloak. He bought incense to live in the dusty smell of his rooms, and daily tended to his front-descent roommates, which were growing nicely in their respective perches. He spent hours watching the Holonet news to remind himself of the current events. Last of all, he managed to locate a local underground dealer of fine sapphire tea and just had collected his order that afternoon. This last achievement was the kingpin of a much larger scheme that had to do with Qui-Gon Jinn, namely, to get the bull-headed man to talk to him. Ben had been experiencing problems connecting with the Jedi he'd once known, it was true, but Qui-Gon was in a class all on his own. He had been outright avoiding Ben since the day he'd appeared. Now, weeks later, even when Ben saw Obi-Wan by himself, he could sense the Master's aura of distrust hanging around the boy. It hurt Ben more than he cared to say. He understood where it came from, however, and it was in this understanding that allowed him to develop a strategy. With the calm ease of a freighter mech train, the negotiator laid his trap and lay in pursuit. He knew the path that Qui-Gon took back to his quarters every day. All he had to do was go to the main corridor at the right moment and time his stroll just perfectly, and if the Force was with him, he could cross paths with his old master just as he turned the corner from the lift. The Force was indeed with him that day. "Ah, Master Jinn." Ben smiled with mock surprise, pretending not to notice Qui-Gon's reflexive air of alarm. "I see your apprentice more than I see you these days." He laughed at his own joke. Qui-Gon looked uncomfortable. "Master Ben." The taller man bowed politely. He was likely the only one in the entire temple who had taken Ben's preference for his moniker to heart, but the choice had mostly been to avoid his surname. Both of them knew this. "You look well. I hope you are settling in." "I am," Ben smiled back. "In fact, I was just on my way back to sample this tea I've just bought." He produced the small, flimsy plastic bag of leaves. "Whole leaf H. sapir." Qui-Gon's brows lifted. "That is an unusually fine sample for Coruscant. Where did you find it?" Ben smiled secretively. "I have my sources. Would you like to join me for a cup of tea, Master Jin?" Qui-Gon hesitated, now seeing the trap for what it was. He regarded Ben with intense chagrin. It had been Qui-Gon who had taught Obi-Wan how incredibly rude it was to refuse an invitation to tea, and now he was trapped by his own precepts, with his very favorite variety of tea, no less. He should have seen it coming. "Of course," he said, and Ben's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with shrewd satisfaction. "Wonderful. My rooms are just this way." Qui-Gon had not allowed himself to imagine what Ben's living quarters would look like, but somehow these were not at all what he was expecting. Perhaps he had internalized images of Obi-Wan's room and extrapolated them. Closed windows, a messy bed, neatly pressed clothes in a closet, and copious amounts of holobooks strewn all around. With these latent images in mind, Ben's small apartment could not have been more surprising. It was a well-lit space. The windows were all open, though some had the blinds drawn halfway to block the evening sun. The door to the balcony was cracked open too, and he could hear the soft wind chimes singing from the spot outside. It was a cramped apartment, but the furniture was arranged comfortably and spaciously, making the whole room seem bigger than he knew it actually was. The copious amounts of holobooks, though they were indeed great in number, had been neatly arranged onto a bookshelf, only a few lying out on the tabletop for reading. By far the most surprising element of all was the plants, happy little things, sitting spry and healthy in the ceramic homes. "My apprentice would call these strays," Qui-Gon observed, bending down to stroke the leaves of the young wuxia plant sitting on the tea table. "I believe pathetic life form is his favorite," Ben replied from the kitchen, ceramic tea kit clinking on the counter. He appeared moments later with a laden tea tray. "But he won't tell you that." "Won't he?" Qui-Gon asked, eyeing Ben's face. Master Kenobi set the tray on the table, moving the wuxia to one side. He gestured for Qui-Gon to take a seat, so the two were facing each other over tea. "Not until he's old and soft and come to realize that plants can be excellent company if one is desperate enough." Ben poured a bowl, first for Qui-Gon and then for himself. "You were always right about that. I feel I owe you an apology." "You owe me nothing," Qui-Gon said, almost offensively. Ben nodded to himself slowly. So they were to get right into it then. As a younger man, Ben's wit had been as sharp as a razor and as meandering as a maze, but many years of talking had taught him that there was nothing to be gained in unappreciated superfluity. "From a certain point of view," Ben said, savoring his first sip of sapir, which had to be said was of an incredibly fine stock. "But from another point of view, I owe you everything I am. I know you dislike the idea, Master Jin, but you were my master." "It is not that," Qui-Gon said, holding but not partaking from his bowl. "I do not dislike you, Master Ben." "You dislike what I am, then. You dislike how I have upset things." Qui-Gon hesitated and then let out his breath. Well, it was only true. "And do you blame me?" "Not in the slightest. Truthfully, I would be insulted if you were any less protective of your apprentice." Ben smiled. "I know that my presence has caused confusion on your bond with Obi-Wan, and I apologize for it. I wish it were not so. However," Ben paused, allowing himself to be vulnerable as the only extant version of his master glared at him over a cup of his favorite tea. "I am without friends here, Qui-Gon." It felt like begging. "And whether you know it or not, you know me better than any other person alive, even Obi-Wan." "I have no idea what kind of man you are," Qui-Gon said, voice haunted by thoughts of old apprentices, of the way Ben had spoken of the Sith mere weeks before. "You know exactly the kind of man I am," Ben replied, a small smile hiding behind his beard. "From whom do you think I learned how to spoil this many pathetic life forms?" He gestured to the resident greenery. "I am hardly a botanist." Qui-Gon glanced around the room at the plants, at the incense burner in the corner. They were not things that his apprentice had ever cherished, In fact, Obi-Wan habitually moaned about his master's collection of plants, arguing that they received better treatment than he did. And it was Qui-Gon, not Obi-Wan, who so often raised the blinds on their windows when they meditated, who lit incense on cold nights to spice the air. But Ben's Force signature was so similar to Obi-Wan's. Not quite as similar as it had been that first day, but similar enough to make his throat constrict in foreign emotion. Unable to pinpoint why Ben was still wrong in what he said, he was, though, Qui-Gon sipped at his tea. Ben followed suit, and a long silence passed between them. "This is very good," Qui-Gon admitted quietly. Sapir had long been his favorite tea, and these days Obi-Wan made it a morning staple. He wondered if Ben had developed his own affinity, or if he was catering. "You're welcome to come back at any time to share," Ben told him, and added, "if we still have any left, that is." His question answered, Qui-Gon allowed a small smile to cross his face. Eventually, the taller master rose and left for his own quarters with a quiet, awkward air. They had drunk the rest of their tea in silence and had said little in way of parting, but Ben still counted the meeting as a resounding success. He'd spoken to Qui-Gon Jinn, and he'd made him smile. One small step at a time. "He thinks he's the master here," Ben told the Wuxia as he collected the tea things onto the tray. "What he doesn't know is that behind this fresh young face I've got a solid 6 years on him. An odd thing to be older than one's master." He hefted the tray into the kitchen and loaded the dishes into the Sonic. "Hardly the oddest facet of my new employment. Still," Ben chuckled, rinsing but not scrubbing the teapot, "I think I should like to buy more Sapir."